It's a big boat. Somebody's yacht. Hey guys, Tim Bratz here. I got a great question the other day from someone asking if they should sell their property and if it makes sense to sell their property now with interest rates going up. They got a couple $100,000 of equity in the property that they have, and they're wondering, does it make sense to sell? Are values going to come down? Are values going to go up? Are they going to stay stable? Is now the time to move over? What are they going to do with the money? And so in this video, I want to talk to you specifically about a principle called return on equity. This is kind of a 200, 300 level idea in real estate. You know, initially you're thinking about return on investment when you go to buy something. Once you already own something, now you're looking at return on equity. So let's go sit down and do some math. All right, so let's dive into return on equity. There are two primary variables when it comes to return on equity that you need to be able to compute in order to figure out, does it make sense to buy or sell or hold or whatever decision you want to make. So the first one is, how much equity do you actually have in the property? And this is where I think people get a little bit confused, because they say, oh, well, I have $200,000 in this house over here. Do you have $200,000? Is that based on some number that you saw on Zillow and what you owe on it? But there's a few more factors that they don't talk about on HGTV, like closing costs. You can expect at least 2 to 3% in closing costs whenever you sell a property. And what about commissions? If you have to list this property with an agent and it sells, you're gonna have to pay them some sort of commission. What does that look like? Depends on the size of the deal. I have properties where I have listing agreements at 1.25% because it's a $30 million listing. I have other deals that are under $1 million that the agent wants 6 or 7% commission on. So it depends on how big the deal is and what you can negotiate with an agent. Even if you're going to sell it for sale by owner and somebody brings their client, their buyers, like a buyer's agent brings their buyer to you, you're probably gonna have to pay them 2, 3, 4% in order to just pay that buyer's agent, even if you sell it on your own. Compute that stuff in. Here's the other thing. Is it actually gonna sell at a realistic price? Is it realistic that you have $200,000 of equity? Well, interest rates are going up, values are coming down because people can't spend as much money on the principal price point of the property because they're spending more money on the interest and the cost of the capital. So now you think you might have $200,000, but that could be your thought of the property value from 6 months ago. Today's a very different scenario. Let's say it sits on the market. Let's say you have to drop the price point by $50,000 or $75,000. That's going to considerably change what your return on equity is going to be, because that amount is a lot less. The other thing that I would mention is this your primary residence or is this an investment property? Have you owned it for less than a year? Because if so, you're gonna have to pay short-term capital gains on that. If you've owned it for longer than a year, then you only pay long-term capital gains taxes, which is gonna be probably 15, 20% depending on your tax bracket, versus whatever your earned income tax bracket is if you've owned it for less than a year. The other thing is, if it's your primary residence and you've owned it for at least 2 years and lived in it for at least 2 years, then the first $250,000 of gain is non-taxable to you. Or if you're married filing jointly, it's up to $500,000 of equity is non-taxable to you. So that plays a big differential in what is your big tax liability after you sell the property and how much money do you actually keep to be able to reinvest into new deals. The second part of the equation, after you figure out how much true equity and cash you're going to be left with after you sell the property, pay all closing costs, pay all taxes, income taxes, what is that tranche of capital that you're left with? That's very important to know. The second part of it is, what kind of return is that equity kicking off today if you decided to keep the property? So what you want to do here is calculate what your cash flow is. Cash flow to me is not the gross rent. You have your gross rental revenue minus all your operating expenses. So that's your taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, management. Then whatever your debt service is, you reduce it by that. And that's what you're left over with, a cash flow, your free cash flow. So you want to take that, but it's more than just that, because a lot of properties, one of the big fallacies is that when you buy rental property, like you get wildly rich off of the cash flow. Not necessarily the case. Where you build majority of your wealth in owning rental real estate is by principal paydown and property appreciation. So you're looking at the free cash flow that's actually going into your pocket every single month, but also part of that mortgage payment that you're making, part of its interest payment that goes to the bank that you'll never see again, but part of its principal paydown. How much principal are you paying down on that property as well? So every month you want to add in, well, here's what the cash flow is, here's what the principal paydown is, and I don't really like to speculate on appreciation or rent growth or anything along those lines. So I personally wouldn't calculate those in, but I would take principal paydown and I would take the cash flow. Take those numbers, annualize it, meaning multiply it by 12 in order to get an annual number, and you take whatever that return number is divided by the total equity that you're going to be left with, and what does that ROI look like? That's what your return on equity is. So based on what that number is, let's say it's 8%. Well, if you sold your home or you sold your investment property and you're making an 8% return on equity right now, can you deploy that money and make better than an 8%? So if you're getting an 8% return on your equity, can you roll that money forward into a new deal, into a new offering, and get a higher return on your equity there? Realizing there's a few different components that come with that, right? Like, you know what your building is right now. You know what your property is right now. There's no question marks. There's no unknowns. There's no behind the scenes hidden things that couldn't go wrong with this property. On a new property, you don't know. So there's some pieces there that could be some things being hidden from you by the seller. There's some things that could be unknown behind the walls. There's some issues that you might not know that are arising with the current tenants. And so you got to be able to weigh out what that looks like. Not always can you quantify what that looks like. The other thing is, what is the headache of having to sell this and then take your time, take your efforts, and roll this into a new deal? Can you get the returns you're looking for? I know you might think you can, right? And as an active real estate investor, we're always like, oh yeah, we can totally get better than 8%. Well, if this is a passive building and you're comparing it to an active new operation that you have to go into and value add and put sweat equity into it over the next 6, 12, 24 months, you're comparing apples to oranges. It's not apples to apples. Now, if you're comparing it to also making it 8% by managing this property over here versus passively investing in another deal where you're making an 8% plus some equity upside in a syndication or some other private lending opportunity, understand you're doing less work than what you're doing right now. So weigh that out, see what that looks like for you and for what your long-term goals are. And finally, what I would consider is that from my experience of doing a lot of deals for a very long time, wealth isn't made by selling property. It's by holding property. It's by holding assets. So if there's a way, is that the gator?
Yep. That's it.
That was it. So alligators don't do well in salt water, and we just saw an alligator out here in the salt water, which you don't see in the marshes and stuff of Charleston. So it must have come from some inland pond or creek or lake or something and got mixed up over here. But alligators, like crocodiles, which are not found in Charleston, South Carolina, we only have alligators here, but crocodiles can like push the salt out of their skin. Alligators cannot. So once they get into salt water, they get very, very sick and don't do too well. So that guy must be pretty screwed up right now. But anyways, let's go back to holding versus selling. Wealth is built by holding assets, not by selling assets. Like I told you before, you sell, maybe you're in growth mode, maybe there's some different scenarios where it does make sense to sell. Maybe it's a heavy management intensive property, maybe you got a bad partner in it, maybe there's it's more of a C or D class type of a property and it's not something you see yourself holding on to long term. I get it, but if you got a nice property and it's cash flowing and it's doing pretty well and it has it's in good shape and it's got some runway with it, I would always lean towards holding it. and trying to tap into that equity in a different way. Maybe you could bring on an investor and sell them off a little piece of the equity for $100,000 or $200,000, give them a percentage of ownership in that property, and then you take that cash and go and roll somewhere else with it, and you still maintain 60, 70, 80% ownership in that property you're talking about. You know, and then that still allows you to tap in and get into something else. Put a second mortgage on it, right? Put a lien on it. Go and get a private loan against it of some way to tap into the equity if you really want to be able to pull from that in order to pursue some other endeavors or pursue some other assets and opportunities, buying opportunities. Not really a mentor, but a guy I met in real estate that I was trying to buy a property from. He said something pretty profound to me. He said one of his mentors taught him that you should congratulate the buyers of real estate and sympathize with the sellers of real estate. And I was like, well, why? The seller's the one walking away with all the cash. He goes, that's not how wealth is built. Wealth is built by owning and holding real estate. The seller's got to sell because they need to sell. The buyer's buying because they can buy. And that is a better position to be in. So if you already own assets and you can hold those assets, I would highly suggest holding as long as you possibly can, figuring out a way to increase the return on equity as opposed to selling it and trying to find something better. There's ways that you can increase the income, decrease the expenses, expand the net operating income, which would grow what your return on equity would be. So that would be the response that I would give to the young guy who said, hey, I want to sell my house. I got $200,000 of equity in it. You know, should I do it? Should I not do it? What does that look like? That would be my response. So if you have a portfolio of rental real estate, one of the things that I would do probably on an annual basis is look at what does your return on equity look like. Calculate what we just went through on every single one of your properties. If it makes sense to sell, especially if there's some intangibles like headache partners or headache management or headache area, it could make sense to sell. Roll that money into something bigger, something better, something that gives you the lifestyle that you're looking for as opposed to dealing with the headaches just because you got a little bit higher of an ROI, or maybe you're not getting that high of an ROI and you just think you are. So go out there and calculate the return on equity on your deals on an annual basis. And that's going to give you a lot more clarity and a lot more awareness and a lot more direction on which properties to hold, which properties to sell, and where to buy more of. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you got some takeaways, please put it in the comment section below. Please like the video. That always helps our algorithm and gets us in front of more people. And if you know anybody who would get some value out of this, please share this with them and let them see and get some insight on how to value their portfolio in order to make sure that they're making the highest returns that they possibly can, so that way they can make more money, do more things with it, be a better person, give more, support more, help more with building a bigger portfolio. So appreciate you guys. Please subscribe to the channel, and until next time, be your best.